Welcome back to the Last Days Book Club, where we're reading the book entitled Dwelling in the Secret Place by Sonica Veith. This is an ebook available online for free at clashofminds.com, where you can download it and read along with us. Sonica Veith is the spouse of well-known evangelist, lecturer, university professor and zoologist, Dr. Walter Veith. And this true story is a chronicle of their life together, their ministry, their numerous trials, tribulations, and hardships, as well as their successes, victories, and triumphs. In our last reading, we covered chapter 13, entitled A New Era, where the Veiths continue to experience both hardships and successes. The chapter opens with them broke as usual, with the heavy load of debt continuously hanging over their heads. And in his prayer, Walter tells God that this house which they built with their own hands, they will have to sell. They put it on the market, and for over a year nothing happens, so they take it off the market. In the meanwhile, Sonica gets sick, and they realize she has been poisoned by arsenic from her job, so she quits that job. Then their son Robert, at age 19, suffers what appears to be a massive heart attack, and his heart stops beating on the way to the hospital, and he has to be shocked to return to life. Turns out that he had a rare disease called Wolff-Parkinson-White syndrome, where the heart has an extra nerve. There were only 2 electrocardiologists in the country who could operate on him, and they were both out of the country. They had to monitor him closely. Then, after this drama, the realtor appears one day and asks if the house is still for sale. It is sold, and they look for another house after paying off their debt that had been like a milestone around their necks. However, the money left was not enough to buy a home in a nice location. After looking at many homes, the realtor told them of a home that would cost more than $200,000 above what they had to spend, but they went to see it anyway. Sonica immediately loved it and spoke with the gentleman who owned the place as she walked with him in the garden with a little pond. And there she saw a chameleon which had fallen into the pond. And being an animal lover, she picked the little creature up, stroked it, and put it back in the tree. For that little act of animal kindness, the man sold them the house for the money they had. Incredible. God was continuing to work in their lives. Walter was now receiving letters and invitations from all over the world to present his lectures, and they decided to take a year off without pay to fulfill many of these invitations. But the devil was busy. Someone got a hold of their itinerary and sent warnings to every church and pastor ahead of their arrival, warning them not to allow Walter to speak. Despite this and continuous opposition from pastors and conferences, the lectures were well received, and many people from all walks of life were converted. In Tulsa, Oklahoma, they discovered that city to be a hotbed of Freemasonry, and Walter was able to get much inside information and pictures for his lectures. Of course, the organizers did not want him to use this information, but Walter ignored them as usual, and many Freemasons heard his lectures and left the Masonry, offering Walter even more ammunition for future lectures, and they asked for Bible studies. The reluctant organizers were overjoyed. In Germany, where Walter spoke of his scientific research confirming Ellen White's health pronouncements, he was verbally attacked by doctors at his lecture who came prepared with loudspeakers to drown him out. But even them, after studying his conclusions, had to come and apologize, proclaiming that what he taught was truth. In Spain, where he spoke of the occult, women who claimed to be white witches came to him, confessing their affiliations and thanking him for bringing the light of truth to them. In the Czech Republic, he was cold-shouldered by the pastor of the church where he was speaking, and who did everything to belittle him. Nonetheless, at the end of the lectures, he came to Walter and apologized. His grandmother, who had attended every lecture, had told him that now she could die peacefully because she knew the Adventist message and the truth was still alive. In many countries, older pastors came to him and hugged him with tears because he had brought back the message that they had so long loved but could no longer hear nor preach. In Australia, he was invited to speak to the students at Avondale, the Adventist college there, where again he was assailed by the scientists and theologists for his defense of the creation story versus evolution, and this in an Adventist institution. They cut his speaking time from 40 minutes to 10 minutes. Nonetheless, as he presented scientific facts to support his confirmation of the creation account, he received a standing ovation from the students, much to the chagrin of the scientists. However, while in Australia, they were able to visit Sunnyside, Ellen White's home, while she was in Australia. Sonica got to see the clothes she wore, the things she had used in the house, and even sat at her desk. The old curator was so happy at their visit that tears came to his eyes because so few people nowadays visited the museum, and the institution, Avondale, seemed to be embarrassed by its presence. Their most surprising experience was in Ogden, Utah, where Walter was invited to participate in an Adventist event to determine the church's stand on the creation versus evolution matter. At this event, they could not believe the position of many high-ranking Adventists on almost all matters biblical. There was one representative from Germany who rudely and publicly declared to Walter that he ate meat and that he had nothing to do with Ellen White. When the group was taken to visit the Mormon tabernacle, the guide declared that when Adam sinned, it brought joy to mankind. Walter whispered to the president of the GC how irreligious that was. The man ignored him and turned coldly away to follow after the guide. On their way back to the airport, in a shuttle bus, the editor of the magazine Adventist Today sat next to them and they struck up a conversation. They soon realized that the man who was a born Adventist truly didn't believe much of Adventist doctrines. He wasn't even sure about the state of the dead. He thought Ellen White was just a good person and nothing else. He only kept the Sabbath because he was a born Adventist. But if he had been born Catholic, he would keep Sunday. And they didn't dare ask him about how he felt concerning the sanctuary or the three angels' messages. On their final stop in Oslo, Norway, they had a wonderful time at an international Bible school where they were located in the beautiful countryside with all natural gardens, and Sonica helped with the preparation of healthy food for both students and staff. They felt at home among people who loved the Lord and delighted in His natural provisions. Finally, on the flight home, as they reviewed their experiences, they fell asleep with the thought that they should sell their house and move to the country. Dear listeners, don't forget, you can download this book for free from clashofminds.com as we pick up the story today in chapter 14, entitled The Desert Shall Rejoice. Isaiah 35, verse 1. The wilderness and the solitary place shall be glad for them, and the desert shall rejoice and blossom as the rose. Back in South Africa, we could feel the heightened pressure from all sides. At work, Walter had to take the brunt of everything that went wrong during the time that he was away doing his work for God. Envious colleagues sabotaged his postgraduate students' work by switching off the refrigerators where they kept their samples for analysis, and a whole year's work was destroyed. University policies were changing, and lecturers were now required to give supplementary tuition to students on Saturdays. And the highway to work had become increasingly dangerous, with riots, stone throwing, and rivalry shootings on the roads between bus companies and taxis. In addition to all those challenges, the ministry he had been working with in Canada and the US was demanding more and more of his time since he had become the main speaker on their satellite channel. The time had come for Walter to leave the world behind and work full-time in God's vineyard, doing that which he loved and was inspired to do. He was grateful that the university had provided the opportunities to do the scientific research which supported our health message. But it was time to move on. It was a big decision, but once again, the Lord had provided, and the Cape Conference offered Walter permanent employment despite the outcries from some quarters. Our conference president at that time supported the work that he did, and at the next camp meeting, he initiated and performed the ordination of Walter as pastor in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. What an honor and blessing the Lord bestowed on him. He was now a recognized and ordained pastor and evangelist in this great end-time movement worldwide. After the ceremony, a German man approached us. He had flown all the way from Germany to speak to Walter and to take pictures of the event. Henry Stober was a professional photographer and filmmaker, and this divine appointment was the beginning of a number of recordings and series produced by him in Europe, Africa, and Iceland together with Walter. Their teamwork in the Creation Outreach in Germany, which screened Henry's movie The Creation, The Earth is a Witness, drew thousands of enthusiastic viewers in a secular and often atheistic Germany, in spite of sometimes immense opposition. Not only did Henry present this beautiful and heartwarming work for God to the world, but this was also the beginning of a long relationship between the two Germans, even though they were oceans apart on two different continents. But we hadn't forgotten God's voice speaking to us and reminding us of our decision to move to the country. Soon we found a large farm in the small Karoo, with its characteristic thorn trees, rhinoceros bushes, and tumbleweeds, some 300 kilometers from Cape Town. For the second time since we became Adventists, we ventured into the unknown, and we hoped that this time would be more blessed than the first. We immediately put our house on the market, and to our surprise, the market value of property hit a record high that season. Within a month, we sold our little house, previously valued at around 600,000 rand, for more than double that amount. This was beyond what we expected or prayed for. However, it was still not enough to buy the farm. The 4,000-hectare farm was situated up against the mountains and had a beautiful waterfall and drinking water from a couple of springs, as well as semi-desert plains and valleys where buck and many species of wild animals roamed. But the house was dilapidated, and the arable land needed to be cultivated. Then a friend introduced us to a young Adventist couple who were also looking for land in that area, and we decided to buy the farm together, with the understanding that when we were away on evangelistic trips, they would keep an eye on the farm. They built their house on a separate piece of land, and we renovated our old farmhouse. Our farm was situated more than 50 kilometers from the nearest town, and more than half of the way was dirt road, which was often badly damaged by floods from the mountain. It was a challenge to drive that distance almost daily to buy supplies and building material in faithful Susie, our old Isuzu pickup truck. For 3 months, we lived in a tent while we were building, with no bathroom or cooking facilities. I learned quickly to dig pits and cook vegetarian food on the fire, and after months of exercising my survival skills, we eventually settled down and started growing and preserving our own food. Soon the invitations to African as well as overseas countries started rolling in again. In Europe, Walter met interesting people who the Lord had called into his fold, but at the same time, Walter was disappointed at the direction our church was taking. He was invited to speak in a small town on the former East German side of Germany. The man who fetched him at the airport told him the story of how the little church was established and why they invited Walter to speak to them. Before the Iron Curtain fell, Igor was an East German border officer who was trained to prevent people from escaping from East Germany across the border to West Germany. After the Cold War was over and the borders were opened again, West Germany's policies were introduced into the East side, and life started changing for him in many ways. One day, he received his paycheck, and in it, he noticed that the government had subtracted a monthly amount for church tax, as it is the policy in West Germany. The unhappy Igor went to the clerk and told him that he was not religious. He didn't believe in God, and therefore they should stop subtracting money from him. The only way you can stop it is by resigning from your church, the clerk said. But I don't have a church, I told you. Okay then, I resign from the church, Igor said in desperation. The clerk started filling out a form. What church are you resigning from? I don't know. What church is the main church around here? Igor asked impatiently. The Lutheran Church. Okay, I resign from the Lutheran Church. The clerk looked at him, shook his head, and continued to fill out the form. That weekend, Igor visited his family and told his parents about the ridiculous policies of the West and that he had to resign from the Lutheran Church. But Igor, we're not Lutheran, we're Catholic, his mother said with fear in her voice. Having lived under communist rule for so long, religious people were still afraid to put a foot wrong. Oh, Igor said, I'll have to fix that. The following day, he went back to the office. I have resigned from the wrong church. I have to resign from the Catholic Church, not the Lutheran Church. His colleagues looked at him as if he had lost his mind. But without a word, the clerk tore up the previous document and started to fill out a new form. During the next few months, Igor met a man who seemed to know a lot about what goes on in the world, and he learned that the man was a Seventh-day Adventist. But they lost contact, and since he had a lot more free time than when he was patrolling the border, he decided one day to find an Adventist church. He phoned the number in the telephone directory, and the pastor answered. Hello? Hello? Is this the manager of the organization? I would like to join your club, he said. The surprised pastor told him that he will have to go through some studies before he can join the club, and they agreed to study the Bible together. He started attending church services, but after a while he got bored and went to speak to the pastor. I've been coming to the meetings every Saturday, but there's not much happening. What is it that you do in this club? Don't you do something other than meet once a week? At the book club, you read books. At the card club, you play cards. What is it that you do? Igor asked with frustration in his voice. The pastor wanted to explain to the man that this is how a church functions. But then he thought he would keep him busy, as he remembered that after the Cold War, the government returned material that was confiscated from the churches, and that there were loads of boxes in storage that needed to be sorted. Igor was excited to have something to do, and faithfully proceeded to sort out what the church wanted to keep and what needed to be destroyed. One day, he came across a box of old-looking books, and when he asked the pastor what he should do with them, the pastor took one look and said, "Burn them." Burn them? Are these not Adventist books? He asked. Yes, they are Adventist books, but they're not relevant anymore. We can't use them. Just burn them, the pastor replied. Igor decided not to burn the books and took them home to see what was not relevant about them. And for the first time, after reading through some of the books, he understood the gospel and he knew that this was the truth. Excitedly, he continued to devour all the books written by Ellen G. White. But he had a problem. He was now convinced that he was the only true Adventist left. Then he decided to set out on a mission to find others in the Adventist churches who believe that these books contained the eternal Bible truth. And that, Pastor Veith, is how I found a handful of true fellow believers who believe in the relevance of the spirit of prophecy for our time. They were spread all over East Germany, and then we got together and started a church. And this is the church where you will be preaching, Igor said with a smile as he turned into the church grounds. At the opening night, there was great excitement. The organizers had invited the mayor of the town, complete in his official regalia, as well as the Oompa band, to entertain the audience and attend the lectures. There was a low buzz of happy anticipation, but just before the first lecture was to start, a man walked up to Walter. "Are you going to preach about the three angels' messages?" he asked. Thinking that he was a church member, Walter answered, "Yes, I will be speaking about it later in the series." The next minute, the man turned towards the audience and started yelling, "Get out! Get out! This man is from the devil. He's going to preach the three angels' messages." There was a deathly silence in the hall. Walter prayed silently that God would remove the man, and the next minute, he started walking down the aisle towards the door, still screaming like a madman, until he was gone. But the devil was not done yet. Walter had just started his lecture when a woman in the audience screamed and fell off her chair unconscious. Again, consternation filled the hall as people were trying to find a doctor in the audience. Eventually, the woman was taken to a back room where she was stabilized, and although unnerved for a few minutes, Walter was able to continue with his lecture. Two of his lectures were on the Bible translations and the received text, the latter being the text that God saw fit to give to the reformers to translate, since both Luther and Tyndale used the received text for the German and English translations. In the audience, Walter noticed a large number of young people, and after the lectures, they approached him. What he discovered confirmed once again that God has a purpose and will do everything to give his people every chance possible to hear the truth. The young people were students at Fredensor Adventist University, which to Walter's amazement was just a short distance from the little conservative church. They told him they were forbidden to attend the lectures and showed him a textbook from the theology department where it stated that the received text was the very worst Greek text. They were also told by the rector of the university that we cannot be dictated to by a woman with only 3 years of education, referring to Ellen White, who was injured and was unable to attend public school as a young child. Walter's answer to that statement was, if God chose to speak to you through a donkey, let alone a woman with 3 years of education, and you refuse to listen, you could have a confrontation with the angel of the Lord. The students were confused, and the next day, they confronted their lecturers at Fredensor. The result was catastrophic. News spread to the leaders in the conference and the division, and subsequently, Walter was banned from speaking at any church meeting in future in Germany. The division president at that time did everything in his power to malign Walter, and when he finally agreed to meet with Walter to discuss the situation, he never arrived at the agreed and confirmed place and time. The students, however, paid little attention to the tirades of their lecturers. They hired a bus and followed Walter to all the subsequent venues where he was to speak in Germany. They had so many fruitful discussions, and when they returned to their university, they were hopefully fortified to fight the good fight to uphold the truth. 1 Timothy 6 and verse 12. Fight the good fight of faith. Lay hold on eternal life, whereunto thou art also called, and hast professed a good profession before many witnesses. Walter was relieved when he stepped onto the waiting aircraft at Frankfurt Airport. He was exhausted and cherished the few hours of rest before he would arrive in Wales for the camp meeting where he was to be a speaker. Arriving at the camp, he was shown to his room, and he had just settled down when a bedlam of noise sounded from the hall close by. It sounded like a rock concert, and he decided to see what it was. The ear-piercing sounds came from the youth meetings with drums and electric guitars beating out a rhythm that would make the Rolling Stones proud. Young men and women were dancing on tables and clapping their hands to the beat of the songs. Walter then noticed one young man standing outside the door of the hall while looking inside. He walked over to him, and raising his voice to compete with the noise, he asked him what he was doing there outside the hall. "I'm waiting for my friends," he answered. "But why are you not in there with them?" Walter asked. "I am not in there because my Jesus is not in there," he answered plainly. Walter gave him a pat on the shoulder and started to walk away when the young man asked if he could talk to Walter. They found a place where it was not so noisy and started discussing many aspects of our faith. When Walter had to leave, the man asked if he could bring a few of his friends the next day to continue the discussions during the youth meetings. The next day, there are about 20 young people waiting for him in the foyer. "My friends also don't like to worship that way. We don't think it is right," the young man explained. The next hour, Walter answered many questions, and as the news spread, interest grew in the discussions. Soon, there were more than 100 of the youth who preferred to discuss the Bible rather than to hop around and make a noise. One afternoon, Walter decided to explore the town nearby. He enjoyed listening to the strange Welsh language and was deep in thought when he passed by a building site where a barrier had been erected to separate the site from the street and to protect the pedestrians. Too late, he noticed that the crane had lifted a large concrete bucket, suddenly got out of control, and before he knew it, the heavy bucket came crashing through the barrier just as he was walking by. The bucket hit him on his hip, and he went flying across the street, where he lay in a daze for a while, unable to move. All around him, people were passing him by, some even stepping over him, but not one person asked if they could help him. If he had been a drunk in tattered clothes, that would have been understandable. But he was well dressed and had obviously been injured. It was very strange that no one noticed or even heard the crash of the bucket breaking through the barrier or Walter being hit by it. Not even the crane operator noticed that he injured a pedestrian. Or even more strange, no one seemed to notice him lying on the ground. Was Satan able to blind a whole street full of people? After a while, he managed to get up from the road and limped back to the camp. His hip was aching, but fortunately, nothing was broken. A few days later, he arrived in South Africa, tired, battered, and blue. But he was satisfied with what he was able to achieve together with the Lord. He had again exposed the evil work of the Prince of Darkness. And even though he was banned by his own people and struck by a concrete demon, he was grateful that many people were enlightened by his preaching, and that was all worth it. On the farm, we worked hard amidst floods and drought, heat wave and bitter cold, and managed to grow enough food for us and the poorer community in a little town some distance away. When the call came, we would travel to different churches in the country to preach or give an outreach series for the public. And on one of these trips to Bloemfontein, our partner on the farm called and complained that he was no longer willing to take care of our side of the farm. This made it more difficult for me to accompany Walter on longer trips, and I mostly stayed on the farm and took care of it all by myself. One day, we received an unexpected email message from our partners. It was a text from the Bible which said that the Israelites had to get rid of the Amalekites off their land. Saul had disobeyed God when he ordered him to completely destroy the Amalekites and their animals. But Saul chose to spare the life of the king and took some of the livestock back to Israel. This caused the Lord's blessing to be withdrawn from Saul forever. We were wondering what they were trying to say to us when a little girl in the church in town also received a message from one of the daughters of our partners. The message said that the daughter was no longer able to come to church or play with the girls in the church because we no longer serve your pagan Jesus. Shortly after that, we were asked to meet with our partners at their house, and they informed us that they had become part of the Israelite movement that was growing rapidly in South Africa, and that their new friends in that faith wanted to buy us out and take over our part of the farm. We were stunned. We suddenly realized what the email meant that they had sent us earlier. They saw us as Amalekites, and we had to get off their land, or else there would be no blessing on them. Their land? When we reminded them that we owned and brought the land together, they said that the previous owner greeted them first and the day that the transaction was made, and therefore God wanted them to have the land. We were just the vehicle to help them acquire it at that stage. We couldn't believe what was happening to us for the second time. We had just finished our lovely country home with its lush garden in the shade of a large oak tree. We had planted fruit trees and vegetables and had fresh water, fresh air, and lots of exercise. And now we had to leave it all behind? That night, we tossed and turned and had very little sleep. What are we going to do? I asked. Where can we go? Walter thought for a while, and then he said decidedly, we're not leaving. Not leaving? If we stay, they will make our lives unbearable. Already, they've been giving us the cold shoulder, and I started complaining. We will sell them our house and the larger part of the farm. But we will take the land up in the mountain where no one wants to be, and we'll start over again. Start over again? On the rocky, barren mountain? I said in a whimpering voice. Yes, we can do it. We just put one foot in front of the other. I finished our motto sentence with a sigh. The day came when we moved out of our beautiful rustic farmhouse with its thatched roof, and as we were leaving, the new owners came walking in and shouted, "Praise Yahweh! He has given us all of this. Praise Yahweh!" We got into our Susie and drove up the mountain, where a lonely old caravan was standing in a vast empty space scattered with gray rhinoceros bushes. This was to be our new home for the next 3 months. No house, no running water, no fruit trees. In fact, no trees, just a small thorn tree to hide behind when we went to the bathroom, and a couple of puff adders and cobras lurking in the bushes. But my industrious husband started building with a team of often inebriated men, and after a grueling few months, we were able to move into our new home. We planted trees and set up a netted greenhouse for vegetables, and soon we had a lovely home again with a stunning view over the valley. We knew that God had sent us into the country not for ourselves only, but to make a way for our friends to move out too. There were smaller pieces of land that were part of our section on the farm, and soon we had some of our Adventist friends moving onto the land. The small community of fellow believers was growing, but at the same time, our ex-partners were experiencing the opposite. Their new friends who bought us out got annoyed with them and left, and they had so much strife amongst themselves that the couple eventually got divorced and sold their farm. It seemed that getting rid of the Amalekites didn't bring them the blessings they had hoped for. One Friday, our daughter Tanya arrived to visit us for the weekend. She had been going through a rough patch in her life and was doubting God's goodness and His care for us. We were trying to explain to her that life as a Christian is not a bed of roses. And after we all watched the video Pilgrim's Progress, based on John Bunyan's classic story, she was comforted, and for the first time, she understood why God allows hardships in our lives. Clinging to Christ and walking in faith, we should stay on the path and never give up until we reach the celestial city. On the Monday morning, Tanya was leaving early to get back to work. It was 6 o'clock when we greeted her, and Walter left in a hurry to fix the burst water pipe on the farm. As she walked towards the car, I remembered that we hadn't prayed with her, and I ran out to stop her before she left. As I came running at a speed around the corner, my foot caught a pile of poles that I had left on the paving the previous day, and I went flying through the air. I didn't just topple over and fall. It felt like an unseen wind had lifted me high into the air, and I came crashing down on my side with such force that I literally heard the flesh on my arm tear as I plowed into the rough paving bricks. I screamed like a piglet about to be slaughtered, and Tanya came running to see what had happened. It was only when I tried to get up that I noticed that something was wrong with my leg. Blood was pouring from my elbow, and the bones had protruded from the wound. When Walter arrived, he managed to get me up, bandaged the elbow as well as he could, and drove the bumpy dirt road with me lying on the back seat to the local hospital. Arriving at the hospital, the doctor took x-rays and immediately called the orthopedic surgeon at the hospital in Mossel Bay, which was about 100 kilometers away. When he sent for the ambulance, they refused to take me because I was on medical aid and was obliged to make use of the non-government ambulances which were not available in that town. This meant that I had to be crammed into the back of the car again and rushed at Walter's highest speed to the hospital. I was sedated for 2 days while they operated on both my hip and arm. The surgeon explained that he thought that only my femur was broken, but when he opened it up, he saw that the hip socket was shattered and the pelvis was cracked as well. He now had to build a new bone for the new socket to be screwed onto. But thinking that I must have had osteoporosis, he had put the ball of the femur into formalin for later analysis. Now, he couldn't use my own bone as an implant and needed artificial bone. But the orthopedic section of the hospital had no bone, which was very unusual, and he had to phone the nearest hospital in Kinsa, which was more than 100 kilometers away, to bring him the artificial bone. But the ordeal was not over yet. There was a roadblock on the highway between Mossel Bay and Kinsna, and the courier with the bone was stuck there for 4 hours. Eventually, the surgeon got the police to find the courier, but he had been traveling in a civilian car, and there was no way the police could recognize him. I had been on the operating table with an open wound for almost 12 hours when the artificial bone eventually arrived. When I woke up, it was dark in the ICU section where I was lying. A nursing sister was removing an empty blood transfusion bag and replacing it with another. Just before she was done, a young nurse passed by the opening in the curtain and said to the sister, "Sister, that's the wrong blood." And then she continued to walk to the door. The nursing sister frowned and looked at the bag with the blood, then went to the cooler bag in which the third bag was kept on ice, and then back to the one she had just hooked on the stand. "Oh no, this is the wrong blood," she said with panic in her voice. "How did this happen?" As I lay there, I was wondering how the nurse, who had just passed by and never saw what was written on the bags, could know that one bag contained the wrong blood. Before I drifted off to sleep again, I thanked God for what He had done to save me once again from sure disaster. I later learned that the surgeon asked Walter where he had been when the accident occurred, because the injuries were so unusual and of such a nature that it seemed like I had been assaulted with a pole. Fortunately for Walter, there had been enough witnesses to corroborate his story. When the surgeon visited me the next morning, I was told that I may not place my weight on the leg for 6 months because there was nothing to hold the implants and screws until my own bone had grown onto the artificial bone. Also, he had received the results of the bone analysis, and to his surprise, there was no indication of osteoporosis. 6 months is a long time, and it seemed that the bone just wasn't knitting. I was told that if the hip could not heal and be functional, that I could even lose my leg. We then decided to take a break and drove up north to our old friend Uncle Frenchie and his wife, Auntie Emma. I was still on crutches and sitting on a pile of cushions in the car, but we enjoyed visiting with them and driving through the old Kruger National Park with its Big Five and other wild animals. We were about to leave to drive back home when Uncle Frenchie said, "Come with me to Botswana. I have to preach there, and the people will appreciate it very much if you speak to them too." "I can't, Frenchie. I have to get back to the farm." "But it's only for the weekend," Uncle Frenchie tried again. "Nope, I'm going home. We're leaving tomorrow morning," Walter said with finality. The next morning, we left with Uncle Frenchie and Auntie Emma following behind us to the place where our paths would separate, and we would turn towards Cape Town, and they would continue to Botswana. A few meters before we reached Lydenburg, there was an old rickety pickup truck in front of us, driving at a snail's pace. A huge truck was approaching from the front, and as it passed the pickup truck in front of us, a strong gust of wind shook the car. Parts of the body fell off onto the road, its bonnet flew up, and not being able to see the road, the driver suddenly slammed on his brakes. There was no way that we could avoid him, and we smashed into the back of his pickup truck with such a force that our car was a total write-off. The police arrived, and our car was towed to the workshop, and there we were, out on the street, without a car. "Remember the story of Jonah?" Uncle Frenchie said with a broad smile. "He was told to go to Botswana, but he wouldn't go. Then he had a collision with a fish. Bring your luggage. We'll make space in our car." Walter sighed heavily as he said goodbye to his crumpled Toyota, silently grumbling to himself, as Jonah did, and we left in Uncle Frenchie's car for Botswana. But God once again had a purpose. As a result of the lectures they presented there, they were both invited to speak to a large church in Loma Linda, California, a few months later. Once back home, I decided to go shopping for some clothes. I hated shopping for clothes, and especially now with my disability. The nagging thought that I might lose my leg and that I will be struggling along on crutches for the rest of my life caused me to feel lonely and despondent. I limped from one shop to the next, standing at the door and glancing in to see if there were any sale signs. As I stood at the entrance of one of the doors, I felt a strong impression to go inside. I resisted the feeling because I thought to myself that there was no sale at that shop. But then I obeyed the inaudible voice the second time, and I stepped inside. Seconds after I'd taken a step forward, a huge notice board came crashing down behind me. The guard who was standing inside the door was startled and said loudly, "Madame, you could have been killed." People came rushing to the entrance, but I slipped away, and for the first time, I felt again that God was still with me, and that He would get me through the trial that I was going through. Camp meeting was coming up, and Walter had been asked to speak there. We were concerned because I hadn't healed sufficiently yet, and straight after camp meeting, we were both scheduled to fly with Uncle Frenchie on a tour to the Middle East, and from there to Loma Linda in the USA. I was still on pain medication and struggled to sleep without sleeping tablets. My whole body had suffered, and I was at times depressed from the pain and uncertainty. I felt embarrassed about walking with a severe limp on crutches, and I cringed when I saw the farm children mock me and waddle like ducks behind my back. Then one day, I received a call from my friend Esty, who was a trained medical missionary worker and teacher. "I would like to tell you something," she said seriously. "As I was praying this morning, I got the distinct impression that I should come to you and help you." That was strange. I hadn't told anyone of my dilemma and my true state. I brushed the thought aside and said, "There's no need, thank you. I'm doing fine. And besides, we're preparing for camp meeting and the trip overseas next week." She hung up, but the next day she phoned again. "I prayed again today, and I feel strongly that you need my help. I need to do some treatments on you." "Thank you, my friend, but I'm okay," I lied. "There won't be time for treatments." The following day, she phoned me again, and this time, she sounded even more serious. "I really have the strong impression that you need me, so I'm leaving this morning and will see you in a few hours," she said adamantly, and ended the conversation before I could protest. During the next week, before camp meeting, my friend did intense hydrotherapy, massages, and fomentations on me, and also treated me with lots of herbal teas and supplements. Within 3 days, I was no longer on pain or sleeping medications, and the heaviness of mind and body had lifted. I was grateful that she had listened to the voice of the Holy Spirit and not to me, and that she wouldn't give up until she achieved what she set out to do. Walter realized that we needed to ask for help from the church according to the biblical principle in the book of James, and he organized a few pastors and elders to anoint me at the camp meeting. James 5, verse 14. "Is any sick among you? Let him call for the elders of the church, and let them pray over him, anointing him with oil in the name of the Lord." At the camp meeting, I was taken into the vestry, and as I entered, one of the pastors made the remark that it was such a pity that this happened to me, because I was now no longer a good example for the health message. It was just what I didn't need to hear. I was going to tell him that I didn't have osteoporosis and that it was a satanic attack on us to try and stop Walter's work. But I knew he wouldn't believe me. I remembered the text in Proverbs, "Even a fool, when he holdeth his peace, is counted wise." Therefore, not wanting to be a fool, I held my peace. As they had finished praying for me and anointing me, I prayed and poured out my heart in tears. "Dear Lord, if it is your will to heal me, please do it, not for my sake, but for your sake. All I want to do is help my husband in his ministry. I know it is hard for him to do your work and take care of me too." When camp meeting was over, we had a few days before we took the flight out to Egypt, and from there to all the other biblical countries. The others on the tour said to themselves that this woman would never make it with all the walking we had to do. But I made it by God's grace. On my crutch, I walked up tells and down into valleys, across deserts, plains, and through cities. but at night my hip was throbbing and I longed to sleep. When our trip to the Middle East was over, we flew for more than 24 hours to Loma Linda in California, where Pastor Frenchie and Walter were to speak to a crowd of hundreds of people. By now, I was struggling to walk, and the pain was so bad that I was sweating profusely. But I refused to let anyone notice my dilemma and remained mostly in my seat. On Sabbath, a young lady approached me and said, "I saw you sitting here, and I just got the impression that I should come and talk to you. Are you okay?" "Yes, I'm fine, thank you," I said as I smiled my bravest smile. "Are you sure? Is there anything we can do for you? I heard you had a nasty accident. My husband is an orthopedic surgeon, and if you need anything, please let us know," she said kindly, and was just starting to walk away when I realized that it was God who sent her to help me. And how can I say no to God's help? "Well, thank you so much for offering. I would really be grateful if your husband can have a look at my hip," I said. "I have a stabbing, burning pain where the socket is." That same evening, she and her husband came to us armed with a small bag of medical supplies. It turned out that he was a specialist who developed a new technique in injecting anti-inflammatory medication right into the bursa of the hip. After the treatment, they prayed with me and left, and I went to bed wondering if this was going to make any difference. The next morning, when I woke up, the pain was gone, and I was able to walk onto the stage without my crutch. From that moment on, I was recovering rapidly, and by the time we were back in South Africa, I no longer needed the crutch. It suddenly dawned upon me that God used a whole sequence of events to answer our prayers. First, my friend Esty gave me a detoxification treatment to clear my mind and to get me off medications that could prevent God's intervention. Next, God's people anointed me, and I came to understand the significance and importance of praying to God for healing, asking for not my will, but His will, not for my sake, but for the sake of His ministry. And thirdly, He sent me to the only person who was able to give me the required treatment on the other side of the world. And then God Himself did His part in creating the miracle. When I went for a checkup, the doctor was amazed that the bone had grown together and that everything was soundly in place. One day, while we were still in Loma Linda, Walter was summoned by a prominent theology professor, and with him was a representative of interreligious relations at the General Conference. Excitedly, Uncle Frenchie accompanied Walter. He was going to meet the well-known theologian he looked up to and those books he had studied. When they arrived at his office, they noticed in the ice-cold countenances that this was not a meeting to thank Walter for bringing his message to the people of Loma Linda. "Dr. Veith, we need to speak to you. Let me get straight to the point. You should stop saying the things you are saying. You are damaging the image of the church, the professor said in a commanding tone of voice. What am I saying? That is damaging the image of the church, Walter asked. You are preaching that the followers of Islam do not worship the true God of the Bible, but you're wrong. Their God is the same God as ours. They have Abraham as their ancestor. They don't eat pork. They believe in the creation account. We simply differ on the Sabbath and a few other issues, the man said. He also mentioned that Walter was not to preach that the papacy was the Antichrist, as this, according to him, was not part of our fundamental beliefs. Uncle Frenchy looked like he had seen an apparition straight from the abyss. His face was pale with concern and disbelief for what was happening before his own eyes. But my brother, Walter's lectures have brought many people into the church, and he was unable to finish his sentence when both the opposing brethren sat up as if a swarm of hornets had just entered the room. We don't want those people in the church. They just cause confusion and strife, the professor said indignantly. Well, Walter said after a short period of silence, I am merely preaching what the Bible and the spirit of prophecy say. And it is abundantly clear that in the Islamic faith, their God does not have a son. And the Bible says that no man comes to the Father except through the Son. There is no other name whereby all people from all nationalities are saved. We are urged by the spirit of prophecy to overthrow that error. Mohammedanism has its converts in many lands, and its advocates deny the divinity of Christ. Shall this faith be propagated, and the advocates of truth fail to manifest intense zeal to overthrow this error and teach men of the pre-existence of the only Savior of the world? Oh, how we need men who will search and believe the Word of God, who will present Jesus to the world in his divine and human nature, declaring with power and in demonstration of the Spirit that there is none other name under heaven given among men whereby we must be saved. The Home Missionary, September 1, 1892, paragraph 4. It was evident that the two men were involved in ecumenical relations with other faiths, and there was no point in any further discussion. But as Walter and Uncle Frenchy left the building, they were greeted by a young man who came running towards them. Are you Dr. Veith? He asked excitedly. Walter said yes. The young man hugged him and said, I was a New Ager, and now I'm an Adventist because of your lectures. Thank you very much. I really appreciate what you have done for me. How thoughtful of God to encourage the two who were so unsettled after the attack at the professor's office. In fact, the event was so traumatic for the sensitive Pastor Frenchy that he started getting sick later that day with a high fever, and Walter had to take his lectures for the next few evenings. At the next venue, where they were invited to a meeting, two more brethren came forward to thank him. The one was a geologist and the other a neurosurgeon, who both became convinced of the truth through Walter's videos. Are these leaders in our institutions really serious that they don't want these prominent people in our church? What excuse would they have if Jesus asked them that question, we wondered. The meetings turned out to be a great encouragement to us, and after meeting so many interesting new friends, we were sad to go, but we greeted them and left for the airport. I was silently praising God for all the wonders He performed on that trip. We were armed with new energy and fervor, with the knowledge that no matter how daunting a task seemed, our Lord always had us surely in His hand, teaching us to trust Him more and more. "What do you say now, Jonah?" Uncle Frenchie asked jokingly as we finally settled down in our seats on the plane. "If you hadn't had the accident, you and I would not have been together in Botswana, and if we hadn't been there, we would not have been invited to Loma Linda. Just think of all the blessings we would have missed if the fish of providence hadn't spat you out on those shores." The end of chapter 14 of Dwelling in the Secret Place by Sonica, Veith.